The snow had begun before sunrise. By midday, the town of Dry Creek looked like it had been swallowed by winter itself. Wind swept through the narrow street, pushing curtains of white powder against the wooden storefronts. Horses stomped impatiently outside the saloon, their breath rising like smoke in the cold air. Thomas Calder pulled his coat tighter as he stepped down from his wagon. At 58, Thomas had seen many winters in Wyoming territory, but this one had teeth. He tied the reins to a post and rubbed warmth back into his stiff fingers. Just supplies, he muttered to himself. Then back to the ranch. Dry Creek was never a place Thomas lingered. Too many voices, too many memories. He started toward Miller's General Store when something unusual caught his eye. At the edge of the street, standing near the steps of the saloon, was a child. A little girl. She couldn't have been older than 8. Her dress was thin and patched. A worn shawl wrapped around her shoulders did little to keep the wind from cutting through. Snow had gathered in her tangled blonde hair, and her boots looked 2 sizes too big. But what struck Thomas most was this. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. She was just standing there, watching people. Thomas slowed. Folks passed her without stopping. A few glanced down. Most didn't. That bothered him. A child alone in a storm should never go unnoticed. Thomas walked closer. The girl turned her head slightly when she heard his boots crunch through the snow. Her face was dirty, and one cheek was reddened from the cold. But her eyes, they were steady. Stronger than any child's eyes had a right to be. Thomas cleared his throat. "Where's your folks, little one?" The girl didn't answer right away. She studied him. The hat, the coat, the weathered face of a man who had lived a long life outdoors. Finally, she said quietly, "Don't got any." The words landed heavy. Thomas reached slowly into his coat pocket. He pulled out a few coins, small silver pieces that clinked softly in his palm. "Here," he said gently, kneeling so he wasn't towering over her. "This'll get you a hot meal." He held out his hand. The coins glinted against the gray sky. For a moment, the girl simply looked at them. Snowflakes landed on the metal. Thomas expected the usual response: hesitation, relief, gratitude. But instead, the girl slowly lifted her small hand and pushed his hand away. "Keep it," she said. Thomas blinked. "You sure about that?" he asked. Her voice was calm, not rude, not angry, just firm. "I don't need charity." The wind howled between the buildings. Thomas stared at her, trying to understand. She lifted her chin slightly. "If you got work, I'll do that." Thomas let out a quiet breath. "You're what, 8? 8.5. And what kind of work you think you can do in this weather? Whatever needs doing." Her answer came without hesitation. Thomas studied the girl more carefully now. Her hands were red from cold, but they weren't soft. They were scratched, rough, working hands. "You got a name?" he asked. "Clara." "Clara what?" She hesitated. "Just Clara." The wind kicked up harder, blowing snow across the street. Thomas looked down at the coin still resting in his palm, then back at the girl. There was something stubborn in her eyes, something he hadn't seen in a long time. Pride, not the foolish kind, the kind that keeps a person alive. "You been out here long?" he asked. She shrugged. "Since morning." "And nobody gave you work?" "I didn't ask them." Thomas almost smiled. "Why not?" She looked him straight in the eye. "Because most folks would rather toss a coin than trust someone to earn it." The words struck deeper than she probably realized. Thomas slowly stood, fully. For a long moment he said nothing. The storm continued to thicken around them. Finally he asked, "You afraid of horses?" Clara shook her head. "Good," Thomas said, "because I've got a ranch 15 miles west of here." She waited. "And I might have work," he finished. The girl's eyes narrowed slightly. "What kind?" "Feeding chickens, carrying wood, cleaning tack." Her expression didn't change. "Food included?" she asked. Thomas chuckled softly. Yes. And a bed? Yes. Clara considered this carefully. You'll pay me too? Thomas raised an eyebrow. You drive a hard bargain for someone standing in a snowstorm. I'm not asking for favors, she replied. I'm asking for work. For a moment, Thomas Calder felt something stir in his chest. Something old. Something he hadn't felt in years. Respect. He nodded slowly. All right then, Clara. He tucked the coins back into his pocket. Let's see if you're as tough as you sound. The girl glanced once more at the swirling snow, then back at the rancher, and for the first time since Thomas had seen her, a small flicker of hope crossed her face. But neither of them knew that bringing Clara to the ranch would soon uncover a truth about the town of Dry Creek that would change far more lives than either of them expected, and the first sign of trouble would arrive before they even made it out of town. The wind cut sharper as Thomas Calder fastened the last strap across the wagon's canvas cover. Snow was falling harder now, thick flakes swirling across Dry Creek's main street like white smoke. Clara climbed carefully onto the wagon seat beside him. She moved slowly, like someone used to doing things alone without help. Thomas noticed she never asked for a hand. Not once. He clicked his tongue and the horses started forward, hooves crunching through fresh snow. For a few minutes neither of them spoke. The town drifted behind them, dim lanterns glowing in saloon windows, figures hurrying along wooden walkways, doors slamming against the wind. Clara watched it disappear. You been in Dry Creek long? Thomas asked finally. 3 months. That all? She nodded. Came with my ma and pa. Thomas waited. She didn't say anything more. The horses pulled the wagon past the last row of buildings. Soon the open plains stretched ahead, rolling white hills under a gray sky. You said you don't got folks now, Thomas said gently. Clara kept her eyes on the road. Pa got sick first. Her voice was quiet but steady. Fever took him. Doctor said there wasn't much to be done. Thomas gripped the reins a little tighter. Ma lasted another month. The wagon creaked as it rolled through deep snow. She worked laundry for folks in town, Clara continued. Then she got the same cough. She shrugged. After that, it was just me. Thomas didn't speak for a long time. He knew that story too well. Loss had a way of making children sound older than they should. How'd you manage 3 months? He asked. Clara lifted one small shoulder. Sweeping stables, carrying water, cleaning dishes behind the saloon. Anyone paying you proper wages? Not much. Then how'd you eat? Some folks gave food when the work was done. Thomas frowned slightly. And if there wasn't work? Clara's eyes stayed forward. Then I waited till there was. The wind rattled the wagon boards. Thomas studied her out of the corner of his eye. 8 years old, and already living like a grown drifter. You sleep where? He asked. Barns, mostly. He looked at her quickly. In this weather? There's hay. Thomas muttered something under his breath. They rode in silence for another mile. Then Clara spoke. You got a lot of horses? Thomas glanced at her. About 40 head. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. That's a lot of stalls to clean. The comment made Thomas chuckle. You planning to do all that yourself? She shrugged again. If that's the work. You might regret saying that once you see the place. I won't. The certainty in her voice made him smile faintly. The Calder ranch sat low against the plains, surrounded by a long wooden fence and a wide barn that had weathered many winters. As the wagon approached, smoke curled from the ranch house chimney. Clara leaned forward slightly. Her eyes moved carefully across everything. The barn, the corral, the stacked firewood. She was measuring the place the way a ranch hand might, not like a child seeing a new home. The wagon rolled to a stop. Before Thomas could climb down, Clara was already stepping off. She landed in the snow and immediately looked toward the barn. Thomas followed. Inside, the smell of hay and horses wrapped around them like warmth. Several men turned at the sound of the door. Jacob Dunn, Thomas's foreman, walked over first, a tall man with a thick beard and a coat dusted with snow. Boss, Jacob said. Then he noticed Clara. His eyebrows shot up. Who's this? Thomas brushed snow from his hat. This is Clara. Jacob looked from Thomas to the girl. And what exactly is Clara doing here? Working, Clara said before Thomas could answer. Jacob blinked. She's what? Thomas crossed his arms. She asked for work, not charity. One of the ranch hands laughed softly in the background. Jacob rubbed his beard slowly. You serious, Tom? Clara stepped forward slightly. I can carry wood, feed chickens, clean tack. Jacob stared at her. You ever handled a horse? Yes. Ever been kicked by one? No. You will if you're not careful. I'm careful. Jacob glanced at Thomas. She's 8. 8.5, Clara corrected. The barn grew quiet. The men exchanged looks. Finally, Jacob sighed. You sure about this, boss? Thomas looked down at Clara. Her small boots were already buried in snow tracked across the floor. Her coat was thin, but she stood straight, waiting, not begging, waiting to be judged. Thomas spoke calmly. She earns her keep. Jacob looked back at the girl. You know ranch work ain't easy? Clara nodded. That's why it's called work. One of the ranch hands chuckled. Jacob shook his head slowly. Well, I'll be. He turned toward a stack of firewood near the barn door. All right then, Miss 8.5. He pointed to a small armful of logs. First job, carry those into the kitchen. Clara walked over immediately. She crouched and lifted the bundle. It was heavy, too heavy. For a moment it looked like she might drop it, but she adjusted her grip and stood. The men watched in silence. She carried the wood across the barn floor, boots slipping slightly in the snow. Step by step, no complaints, no hesitation. When she reached the kitchen door of the ranch house, she pushed it open with her shoulder and disappeared inside. Jacob looked at Thomas. You sure she'll last the day? Thomas watched the door close behind her. Don't know. Jacob folded his arms. You just pick her up off the street? Thomas nodded. Jacob let out a low whistle. Dry Creek's gonna talk about that. Thomas shrugged. Dry Creek talks about everything. A moment later, the kitchen door opened again. Clara stepped back into the barn. Her arms were empty. What next? She asked. Jacob stared at her for a second. Then he smiled. Well, I'll be damned. He pointed toward the chicken coop outside. Let's see if you can handle 50 angry hens. Clara walked toward the door without another word. But as Thomas watched her step back into the swirling snow, a strange uneasiness crept into his mind. Because across the open plains, far beyond the ranch fence, a lone rider had just appeared on the distant ridge, and the moment the man spotted the Calder ranch, he turned his horse sharply toward it. By the second morning, Clara had already surprised everyone on the Calder ranch. The storm had eased during the night, leaving the plains buried beneath a thick blanket of snow that glittered under a pale winter sun. Most mornings on the ranch started the same way, before daylight. But when Jacob Dunn pushed open the barn doors just after sunrise, he stopped in the doorway. The chicken coop was already open. Feed had been scattered across the ground, and 50 irritated hens were pecking happily in the snow. Jacob frowned. Well now. He stepped closer. The coop had been cleaned too. Fresh straw laid neatly inside. He turned slowly toward the ranch house. Smoke curled from the chimney. Inside the kitchen, Clara stood on a wooden crate beside the stove, stirring something in a cast-iron pot. Thomas Calder sat at the table with a cup of coffee. You see this? Jacob said as he stepped in. Clara didn't look up. Chicken feed was frozen, she said calmly. Had to break it apart first. Jacob stared at her. You been up long? Since before the sun. Thomas raised an eyebrow. You didn't have to start that early. Clara shrugged slightly as she stirred the pot. Work don't wait for sunlight. Jacob chuckled under his breath. Well, I'll be. He sat down heavily at the table. What are you cooking? Oats. For who? All of us. Thomas hid a faint smile behind his coffee cup. Over the next few days, Clara moved through the ranch like she had always belonged there. She fed chickens, carried wood, swept the barn, polished saddles with careful hands, and she never once asked for rest. The ranch hands had started watching her quietly. At first it was amusement, then curiosity. By the 4th day it had turned into respect. Even Jacob admitted it. She works harder than half the men I've hired, he told Thomas one evening. Thomas stood beside the barn fence, watching Clara carry a small bucket toward the horses. She's got something to prove, he said. Jacob nodded slowly. Ain't just that. What do you mean? Jacob leaned against the fence. She's not working for the money. Thomas frowned slightly. Then what? Jacob watched the girl carefully. She's working so nobody can take anything from her. Thomas didn't answer. But deep down, he knew Jacob was right. Clara never took more than her portion of food. She counted every coin Thomas paid her at the end of the day. Then she wrapped the money in cloth and tucked it inside her boot. One evening, Thomas noticed something strange. Clara wasn't spending any of it, not a single coin. You saving for something? He asked as she sat near the kitchen fire. She looked up. Yes. What? For land. Thomas blinked. Land. She nodded. Someday. He studied her for a moment. Most grown men can't afford land around here. I don't need much, she replied quietly. How much you got saved? $2.40. Thomas couldn't help smiling. That's a long road to land, Clara. I've got time. Her answer carried a seriousness that silenced him. But the peace on the ranch didn't last long. Late one afternoon, as the sun dropped low over the snowy plains, the ranch dogs began barking. Jacob stepped outside the barn. A rider was approaching fast. Thomas came out moments later. The horse thundered across the frozen ground and skidded to a stop near the gate. The rider swung down roughly. He was tall, sharp-faced, and dressed in a long black coat dusted with snow. His eyes moved across the ranch yard quickly. Then they landed on Clara. The girl had just stepped out of the chicken coop. For a moment, the man stared at her. Then he smiled slowly. Well now, he said. His voice was cold. Clara froze. Thomas noticed immediately. Her shoulders stiffened. The bucket slipped from her hands and hit the snow. The man stepped forward. You're a hard one to find, little lady. Thomas moved between them. Who are you? The stranger barely looked at him. Name's Walter Briggs, he nodded toward Clara. And that girl belongs to me. The words dropped into the cold air like a stone. Jacob stepped forward. Belongs to you? Briggs smiled again. Her father owed me money. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. What kind of money? Loan, Briggs said casually. Took it before he died. Clara's voice finally broke through. That's not true. Briggs ignored her. When a man dies owing debts, he continued, someone's got to settle them. Jacob frowned. She's 8 years old. 8.5, Briggs said with a smirk. Thomas's voice hardened. You expecting a child to pay you back? Briggs tilted his head slightly. Or work it off. The ranch yard fell silent. The wind blew snow across the ground between them. Clara's small hands clenched at her sides. I don't owe you anything, she said. Briggs laughed softly. You think the world works on what you think, girl? He stepped closer. Thomas didn't move. You got proof of this debt? Thomas asked. Briggs reached slowly into his coat pocket. He pulled out a folded paper, a weathered document with signatures across the bottom. Your pa signed it, Briggs said, holding it up. Thomas took the paper. The ink was faded but clear enough. A loan agreement, $30. Interest added monthly. Thomas's jaw tightened. $30. For a grown rancher, that wasn't much. But for a poor man, it could destroy everything. Clara shook her head. Pa said that man cheated him. Briggs's smile disappeared. Careful what you say, girl. Jacob stepped forward. That paper don't say she owes you anything. Briggs shrugged. Law around here says family debt passes along. Thomas studied the document again. Something about it felt wrong, but proving it would be another matter. Briggs folded his arms. So here's how this goes, he said calmly. She comes with me. Clara's face went pale. Or, Briggs continued, you pay the debt. Thomas looked up slowly. How much? Briggs smiled again. With interest? He paused deliberately. $50. Jacob cursed under his breath. $50 was no small sum. Briggs turned his horse slightly toward the gate. "I'll give you till tomorrow." His eyes returned to Clara. "If she ain't ready to ride with me by sunrise." He smiled coldly. "I'll let the sheriff handle it." The rider swung into the saddle. Snow kicked up behind the horse as he turned toward the road. Clara stood frozen in the yard. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I told you I don't take charity." Thomas looked down at the paper in his hand, then back toward the disappearing rider, and a heavy realization settled in his chest. Because something about that debt didn't just smell wrong. It felt like the beginning of a much bigger fight than anyone at the Calder Ranch had expected. The ranch felt different that night. The storm clouds that had hung over the plains for days began to return, darkening the sky long before sunset. A cold wind swept across the open fields, rattling the barn doors and whispering through the fence posts like something restless moving through the land. Inside the ranch house, the kitchen fire burned low. Thomas Calder sat at the table, the folded debt paper spread out before him again. $50. He had paid more than that for a single horse before. But this wasn't about money anymore. Across the room, Clara sat quietly on the wooden floor near the hearth, carefully repairing a torn glove with a needle and thread Jacob had given her. She worked slowly, with the same careful focus she gave every task. Thomas watched her for a long time before speaking. "You understand," he said quietly. "That man might come back with the sheriff." Clara didn't look up. "I know. And if the law sides with him, I'll go." Her answer came too quickly. Thomas frowned. "You're not scared?" She finally lifted her eyes. There was fear there, but there was something stronger too. "I'm not afraid of work," she said. "I'm afraid of owing someone." Thomas leaned back in his chair. "That's a hard way to live." "It's the only way I know." For a moment neither of them spoke. The wind rattled the window. Then Clara said something so quietly Thomas almost didn't hear it. "My pa tried to borrow money to save the farm." Thomas looked up. He didn't know that man would change the paper after. Thomas's eyes sharpened. "Change it how?" Clara hesitated. "He made my pa mark it again. Said it was just a witness line." Thomas slowly unfolded the paper again. The signature at the bottom was clumsy, like it had been written by someone who wasn't used to writing. But the second mark beside it, that one looked different. The ink was darker, thicker, almost like it had been added later. Thomas felt a slow heat building in his chest. "You're saying Briggs tricked your father?" Clara nodded. "He came back twice asking for more money after that. Pa told him no." Thomas rubbed his jaw. If that was true, then Briggs wasn't collecting a debt. He was stealing a child. But proving that would be another matter entirely. And sunrise was coming fast. Jacob entered the house just then, stamping snow off his boots. "Storm's rolling in again," he said. "Worse than the last one." Thomas looked toward the window. The sky had turned almost black. "If Briggs plans to ride out here tomorrow," Jacob continued, "he might not make it through that." Thomas folded the paper slowly. "That man didn't strike me as someone who turns back easy." Jacob looked over at Clara. "You planning to run, kid?" Clara shook her head. "No." "You could?" "I don't run." Jacob sighed. Stubborn as a mule, Clara gave the smallest hint of a smile. But outside, the wind was already beginning to howl. By midnight, the storm had arrived. Snow slammed against the barn walls in thick waves. The ranch lanterns flickered wildly as the wind tore across the plains. Most of the ranch hands had turned in early, but Thomas couldn't sleep. He stood near the window, staring out into the white darkness. Somewhere out there was a man who believed he could take a child like property. Thomas clenched his jaw. He had buried a daughter once before. The thought of losing another child, even one he had only known for days, sat heavy in his chest. Just after midnight, a sudden crash echoed across the ranch yard. Thomas turned sharply. Then came the sound that made his heart drop. Horses screaming. He grabbed his coat and rushed outside. The storm nearly knocked him sideways. Snow blasted across the yard so thick he could barely see the barn. But the horses were panicking. Their frightened cries cut through the wind like knives. Jacob burst out of the bunkhouse at the same moment. What happened? Don't know. They fought their way through the storm toward the barn. When they reached it, Thomas shoved the door open. The sight inside froze him. One of the side doors had blown open. Snow swirled into the barn, and several horses were already loose, kicking wildly as they tried to escape the storm. But what shocked Thomas most was the small figure standing in the middle of the chaos. Clara. She was trying to calm the animals, her tiny hands gripping a lead rope as one terrified horse reared above her. "Clara!" Thomas shouted. She turned briefly. "The gate broke," she yelled over the wind. "If they run, they'll freeze out there." Another horse slammed into the stall door, splintering wood. Jacob rushed forward, but Clara moved first. She grabbed the frightened horse's bridle and spoke softly into its ear. "Easy. Easy now." The animal stomped and snorted. For a moment it looked like it might kick. Thomas felt his chest tighten. If that horse lashed out. But Clara didn't back away. Slowly, the horse stopped fighting. Its breathing eased. Jacob hurried to secure the stall gate. "Kid," he muttered in disbelief. Outside, the storm howled louder. Another loud crack echoed from the roof beams. Thomas looked up sharply. Snow was piling too fast on the barn roof. If the weight kept building, the structure could collapse. "Everyone out," Jacob shouted. But Clara had already spotted something worse. Two horses had bolted through the open door and disappeared into the storm. Without them, the ranch would lose half its winter breeding stock. Clara turned toward the door. "I'll get them." Thomas grabbed her arm instantly. "No, you won't. They'll die out there." "So will you." But Clara pulled free. "They'll follow me." Before Thomas could stop her, the girl ran straight into the blinding storm. For one terrifying second, Thomas couldn't even see her. The snow swallowed her completely. Jacob cursed loudly. "Tom!" But Thomas was already moving, because in that moment, the rancher realized something that shook him to the core. This wasn't just a girl working on his ranch anymore, and if he lost her out there in that storm, it would break something inside him he had spent years trying to bury. Thomas plunged into the snow after her, not knowing if he would find her, or if the storm had already taken her away. The storm swallowed everything. Thomas Calder could barely see the barn behind him as he pushed into the blinding white wind. Snow cut against his face like shards of glass, and every step sank deep into drifts that reached his knees. "Clara!" he shouted. The wind tore the word away before it traveled 10 feet. For a moment, fear gripped him harder than the cold ever could. Not again. The thought came uninvited. Years ago, he had stood helpless beside another bed, watching fever take the only child he had ever known. That helpless feeling had hollowed him out for years. And now, a small pair of tracks appeared ahead of him in the snow. Tiny footprints, half buried already by the storm. Thomas followed them. They curved toward the far end of the pasture where the fence line met a shallow ravine. Then he heard something, a faint whinny. Through the blowing snow he saw movement. Two dark shapes stood near the broken fence, and between them, Clara. She was gripping one horse's reins with both hands, her boots sliding in the snow as she struggled to guide the frightened animals back toward the ranch. "Easy," she was saying, her voice barely louder than the wind. "Easy now." The horses were trembling but beginning to calm. Thomas ran the last few steps. "Clara," she turned, surprised. For a moment relief crossed her small face. "I almost had them," she said breathlessly. Thomas didn't answer. He simply grabbed the second horse's reins and turned them both toward the barn. "Come on," he said. Together they led the animals slowly through the storm. Every step felt like a mile. But finally the barn lights appeared through the swirling snow. Jacob threw the doors open the moment he saw them. "Well, I'll be—" The horses stumbled inside first. Clara followed. The second the doors slammed shut behind them, the barn fell into a warm, trembling quiet, broken only by the sound of wind outside. Thomas leaned heavily against the stall rail, breathing hard. Clara brushed snow from the horse's mane. "You didn't have to come after me," she said. Thomas stared at her, Snow had melted across her hair and face. Her cheeks were red with cold, and her coat was soaked through. But she was standing there like nothing had happened. "You could have been killed," he said quietly. Clara shrugged. "They needed help." Thomas rubbed a hand across his face. "You're 8 years old." 8.5, Jacob burst out laughing behind them. "Kids got more nerve than half the men in Wyoming." But Thomas wasn't laughing. He was looking at Clara in a way he hadn't before. Not as a worker, not even as a stubborn child, but as someone who had walked into his life and quietly filled a place he hadn't realized was still empty. The storm finally passed near dawn. By sunrise, the plains were silent again, the world buried under fresh snow. Thomas stood outside the ranch gate, watching the road. Clara stood beside him. Neither spoke. Then a distant shape appeared on the horizon. A rider. Walter Briggs. He approached slowly, his horse stepping carefully through the snow. When he reached the gate, he looked from Thomas to Clara. "Well now," Briggs said, "looks like the storm didn't scare you off." Thomas didn't answer. Briggs dismounted and brushed snow from his coat. "So," he said, "you got my money?" Thomas pulled the folded debt paper from his pocket. "I've been looking at this." Briggs smirked. "Hope you brought $50 with it." Thomas held the paper up. "Funny thing about ink," he said calmly. Briggs's smile flickered slightly. "Gets darker the longer it sits." Thomas tapped the bottom of the document. "This signature here, different ink than the rest." Briggs' eyes narrowed. Clara stepped forward. "My pa never signed that second line." Jacob had come up behind them quietly. "And the sheriff's going to want to hear that," he added. For a moment the wind rustled through the fence posts. Briggs looked at the three of them. Then he laughed softly. "You folks think a story from a little girl's going to beat a signed paper?" Thomas folded the document slowly. "No," he stepped forward. "But I do think the sheriff might wonder why you tried to collect a debt from an orphan child." Briggs said nothing. "And I think he'll be mighty curious about that ink, too." Jacob crossed his arms. "Especially after we ride into town and ask him." For the first time, Walter Briggs didn't look so certain. He stared at Clara. The girl didn't look away. Finally, Briggs snatched the paper from Thomas's hand. He crumpled it once in his fist. Then he spat in the snow. "This ain't worth the trouble." He swung into his saddle. "Keep the brat." And with that, he turned his horse and rode back across the frozen plains. Clara watched until the rider disappeared over the ridge. The wind moved quietly through the fence rails. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Clara said softly, "I still owe you wages for yesterday." Jacob groaned. "Kid." But Thomas raised a hand. He looked down at her. "You don't owe me anything." Her brow furrowed. "I worked. And you'll keep working if you want." She nodded slowly. But Thomas continued. "Thing is—" He hesitated. The words felt strange in his mouth. "This ranch could use someone like you." Clara tilted her head slightly. "Someone stubborn?" Thomas chuckled. "Someone brave." He rested a hand gently on her shoulder. "And maybe someone who could use a home." Clara looked down at the snow. For the first time since he had met her, the fierce independence in her eyes softened. "Does that mean—" she began quietly. "You'd stay," Thomas said. "Not as hired help." He paused. "As family." The wind carried the quiet across the plains. Clara stood very still. Then she nodded once, a small, careful nod. And Thomas Calder felt something in his chest settle into place that hadn't rested in years. Behind them, the ranch stood peaceful under the fresh snow. Chickens clucked inside the coop. Horses stomped softly in the barn. And for the first time in a long, long while, the Calder ranch no longer felt empty.